Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, NFL Week 2. For all of you out there that were sick and tired of looking at the exact same matchups that had been on the betting board for Week 1 for nearly 6 months, we can flip the script and move on to how the market has overreacted, how it's underreacted, and some of the things that we learned from Week 1. Buffalo Bills fans, you may want to cover your ears at the top of the show. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined by a very special guest. You may be familiar with his work. He's written for the Bet the Board website, for the last handful of years. He's a professional bettor. He goes by the Twitter handle of Watt05. Billy Attridge steps into the hot seat. And Billy, you're stepping up to the big leagues. This is the September call-up, to use the Major League Baseball equivalent. We're thrilled to get you into the mix to break down some NFL today.
Happy to be here, bud. When Payne shot out the bat signal, I was pumped. And let's get into it.
And for those listeners out there going, man, what happened to Payne? He had a family matter to take care of. Nothing too serious, so don't hit the panic button. He'll be back with us next week, and we're going to put the pressure on Billy aplenty. And you know what, Billy? This allowed us the perfect avenue. Given the display we saw Monday night from a team that you know all too well in Western New York, do you want to go out there and provide a criminal defense for Josh Allen's performance and the collective group effort from Buffalo that should have run away and hid with a win against the Jets, who were forced to go through the majority of that game without Aaron Rodgers?
No defense here. That was very tough to watch. I think when we talk about Buffalo in that game, we have to start with Josh. The word I'd use to describe his performance was just reckless. Right? He did he finish 9th in completion percentage over expectation? Yes. But he hunted the big play not only through the air. We saw the interceptions that were just completely unnecessary, which he owned in the press conference, which is another story because he looked pretty dejected there. But even when he was running, there was one play in the second quarter, about 25 seconds left. It's 3rd and 13. He runs about 6 yards. He's got nowhere to go. And he just leaps into 2 linebackers and a safety. Doesn't even think about sliding. And that was his attitude the entire game. You saw Diggs on the sideline trying to get him going, and he couldn't do it. And that was the biggest concern I saw. But again, it's the first game of the year. It wasn't just a Josh Allen thing. I think you saw Ken Dorsey trying to find his footing with some of the play calls. Opening drive of the game, they start out with 2 straight passes, get the first down, and then we see run, 3rd and 5, we fail, we have to punt. So on that side of the ball, some things we got to work out, but all in all, I'm not overly concerned with the offense.
When do we have to start worrying about Josh Allen? Because you look at not just his performance in Game 1, but his reckless behavior, and I think that's the perfect word to describe some of the performances we've seen in terms of flirting with turnovers. And it hasn't just been interceptions, it's been fumbles as well. And Brian Daboll deserved a ton of credit for helping Josh Allen with his accuracy and his discipline in the pocket. I'm not putting all of the onus on Ken Dorsey by any stretch of the imagination, but what we've started to see over the back half of last year, and obviously just one data point so far this year, is Josh Allen regressing to the quarterback that we saw at Wyoming, that a lot of NFL teams had concerns about how his game would translate. And look, these guys can change their stripes. A tiger can change its stripes. I think I butchered that on one of the podcasts earlier that the listeners pointed out to us. But what do you need to see from Josh Allen this week against the Raiders? Spoiler alert, not a game we're going to cover with a deep dive, to go, okay, I feel a little bit more comfortable. Granted, this is a far inferior defense than the talent level that the Jets can throw out there against you with that high level of familiarity and with superstars at all 3 levels.
I think it's really just about him playing within the offense at this point. And I can't believe I'm saying that about Josh Allen, because most of his greatness comes from plays that extend. But right now, with where he's at, especially we saw it last year in the red zone, all the red zone interceptions, it's okay to take the check down to James Cook. It's okay to hit Dalton Kincaid for 8 yards. Where's Gabe Davis? Where's the targets for Gabe Davis? Not that Gabe Davis has been the best separator, but Josh has to just take what's there and learn to live with some field goals at times, which is wild to say about Buffalo, but I think there needs to be a change in his mindset. He talked about it in the press conference. He said, excuse my language, same shit, different year, different day, but he's doing the same forcing of the ball into double coverage. It's got to stop. Raiders give him an opportunity to do that.
There's no doubt about it. It's the definition of a get-right game on a short week against a Raiders team who's playing in hostile territory for the second straight week. And when you look at the landscape of the NFC East, the division that's going to get a ton of focus on today's show with the exception of Buffalo, clearly you can't afford to let games slip away knowing that the Jets with Zach Wilson not going to be nearly as formidable. At least we are led to believe on the offensive side. But all right, let's get into the first game of week 2 on Thursday night. A game that we saw last year between these two teams. And quite frankly, Billy, it wasn't all that intriguing with Philadelphia running away and hiding. Right now, we're looking at the Eagles on Thursday as a 6-point favorite. There are some 6.5s in the market. Even saw a 5.5 as we started to break this game down. Total sits at 49. That's up a touch from where it opened. But before we get into some of the X's and O's, we look at this number. This price opens substantially higher at 7.5. We've seen largely one-way traffic, and some of that has to do with players that won't be available for the Philadelphia Eagles come Thursday night.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best place to start for this breakdown. Looking at the Eagles and who's not going to be there, we see James Bradbury's going to be out. Nakobe Dean was just put on IR. Reed Blankenship's not going to be playing tonight, and that's where I think Minnesota can have some success on the offensive side of the ball. Sean Desai, defensive coordinator for the Eagles, he's a Vic Fangio disciple. Who also ran a similar system to Vic Fangio was Ed Donatel, who was the former Minnesota defensive coordinator from the past couple years. Fangio's defense tends to send a bit more pressure, but in general, they start with these lighter boxes and bigger defensive linemen. I think we might see some more 11 personnel from the Vikings, targeting that middle of the field where we saw Mac Jones have plenty of success last week.
Yeah, look, I mean, you mentioned Mac Jones, and he was able to pick apart this Eagles defensive backfield with receivers cut from a very different cloth than the Justin Jeffersons and Jordan Addisons of the world that we're going to see on full display. When you look at the Vikings last year, I mean, Kirk Cousins against the Eagles was just 6 of 12 for 48 yards and 2 interceptions when he targeted Justin Jefferson. I mean, last year he had a 71 completion percentage targeting Jefferson early in the game, but that fell, or sorry, for the season, but that fell to roughly 50%. We have visions, as I know Vikings fans do, of Darius Slay intercepting multiple passes, or it felt like every defensive back getting in on the action. And when you dig into the Minnesota Vikings last week, they come up a bit short, 20-17 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Jordan Addison, though, does make a splash, targeted 6 times, has 4 catches, his first career touchdown. We saw TJ Hawkinson as a high-volume receiver, yards per catch, nothing to write home about. But when we look at that Eagles defense, how concerned should we be knowing the strength of that defensive front could actually have a big matchup advantage in the trenches, knowing the Vikings are without Garrett Bradbury and that Christian Darrisaw is expected to go but could be limited dealing with a little bit of an ailment?
Yeah, you brought up a great point there. It's possible Philadelphia can make Minnesota one-dimensional here. I mean, last week, Minnesota finished 31st in rush EPA offense, and now here comes an interior defensive line. Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Milton Williams. Fletcher Cox seems questionable. It looks like he's going to go. They get a backup center in Austin Schlottman and an interior O-line that we already had major concerns about entering the season. So it is difficult to envision success on the ground here. The one thing I'll say, Justin Jefferson brought this up on Tuesday, and last year in this matchup, the Eagles showed some cover zero. And they ran it 6 times. Cousins was 0 for 6 with an interception. Justin Jefferson said they've been practicing with it all week. So the point of cover zero is it forces the quarterback to not go through his progressions. He's got to lock in on one receiver and make the throw, which if you know Kirk Cousins, that is not his style. But just knowing that what they saw last year, putting it ahead in practice, and they have some different weapons. Jordan Addison seems like a dude. Love Adam Thielen, love his career, but it was clearly he lost a step or two the past couple seasons. And you brought up TJ Hawkinson. This could be a big game for him over the middle.
When you look at some of those players, I mean, and I use the age-old adage, having watched way too many White Sox games as a kid growing up in Chicago, the pick to click. I mean, we know Jefferson is the alpha in the room. He expressed some frustration given how he wasn't utilized in the second half after having massive numbers against the Bucs. As far as Addison and Hawkinson, I mean, do we think those guys become the focal point? Do we think we could see a scenario where Darius Slay doesn't always travel but ends up shadowing Jefferson? I mean, you look at some of the underlying numbers. I mean, Slay last year held Cousins to just 1 of 5 for 7 yards when he was targeting Jefferson, had those 2 picks according to Next Gen Stats. So if you're playing this out, you've had a short week to prepare for Kevin O'Connell. You know the level of desperation that comes in. Are we spreading around, just taking what the defense gives us, or are we trying to force feed Jefferson early unless Slay is sitting in his back pocket?
I think spreading around is the right move, and especially with the potential nightmare that's going to happen with this interior defensive line. Cousins may not have 3 to 4 seconds to hold on to this football. So we could see some checkdowns with Madison. Me and you discussed before the show, Jordan Addison's receiving props, we expected a little bit of a higher number there, especially when you consider it looks like the Eagles may be going with Josh Joby filling in at cornerback, who's a young, talented kid. Sean Desai speaks very highly of him. But this is prime time. This is a big spot. He's got a lot on his plate. They lost the red dot in the green dot in Nakobe Dean. And with Christian Ellis potentially filling in, he only had 29 snaps in his career before Sunday. This center of the field is going to be open. So is Slay going to follow Jefferson around? That's a great question. I think if he doesn't, there's going to be a safety over the top, but that could expose some things on that back end with Blankenship out already.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think this is a matchup where when you look at it for Philadelphia, you never want to be down one of your top cover corners. You never want to be down a starting safety that logs as many snaps as Reed Blankenship does. But suddenly you now have multiple weapons you have to contend with for Minnesota. Your point on Adam Thielen was excellent, talking about how he just had no burst and an ability to get off the line. So you didn't have to worry about him beating you for more than 3 to 5 yards downfield. Addison, a significantly better route runner that's got the cut, can get to space, and we saw flashes of the kind of potential that the very talented rookie out of USC can display. On the other side of the ball, when we look at Philadelphia offensively, they had 251 net yards from scrimmage last week against New England. That was fewer than any game started by Hurts in all of 2022. The 17 first downs, one of the lowest numbers that we've seen, and from an EPA standpoint per drive, nothing to write home about whatsoever. One of the biggest questions going into last week stemmed from this Eagles rushing offense, what that group was going to look like. We know how prolific they were last year. New England very stingy on the ground. Lo and behold, the Eagles aren't able to put a rushing touchdown on the board. Kenneth Gainwell, he was the alpha, 18 of the 22 touches by Eagles running backs. He's out for tonight with a rib injury. In steps DeAndre Swift, who we've seen on the big stage look extremely explosive in the past, but he wasn't the only Eagle that was called out by name from head coach Nick Sirianni in terms of getting them the ball in this particular spot.
Yeah, I think that leads us into Dallas Goedert, and 0 catches last week. The game plan was interesting. And this is the first time we've seen the Eagles without Shane Steichen. And it was a weather game. And we're going to talk about that with a lot of these games. When we look back at week 1, there was a lot of rain in the first half. They got up this early lead, right? They got up 16-0 with the Slay pick 6, the Zeke fumble, and they went run heavy early on. And to New England's credit, that is just where they excel. So moving forward here, Sirianni made a point that Swift and Goddard have to get the ball in this matchup. And I think we're going to see them, especially up the middle. Goddard should have some real opportunities here. Last year in this game, the Eagles had the 4th highest rate of explosive passes for any team over the course of the season. when we look at Minnesota's defensive coordinator, Brian Flores, he tends to send pressure regardless of whether it's getting home consistently. He's going to try and make life difficult for Jalen. He was in Pittsburgh last year. Philly had very good success with the deep ball to AJ. He had 6 receptions, 156 yards, 3 touchdowns. But we have seen Brian Flores come up with some decent one-off game plans. I don't know if he's got the talent, though, to put a hold on Goddard, Swift, Smith, and Brown. It just feels like it's just too much.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, because when you look at this Vikings defense, they didn't drum up a lick of pressure last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Just 2 quarterback hits against Baker Mayfield. It was tied for the lowest mark by any team in week 1 so far this season. They bring in Marcus Davenport this offseason to try and help with that pass rush. Davenport inactive. I don't expect him to be out there for this game on a short week either, but look, we've been surprised in the past, and the Vikings haven't officially ruled him out. But what I thought was one of the bigger takeaways actually came from Rachaad White in the Tampa Bay locker room, saying that Baker Mayfield went into the locker room at halftime and said he picked up on the Vikings' defensive signals. Now, I know it's difficult to try and overhaul everything in the span of essentially 72 hours, but you have to think with them tipping their hand, the Vikings are going to be significantly more cognizant of what they're calling out, because if Jalen Hurts is able to diagnose all of these pre-snap reads, because of the weapons he has at his disposal, I mean, this is a Philadelphia team that's going to be able to march up and down the field.
Yeah, that was quite the quote from White. I'm not sure the coaching staff will love that he divulged that, but
hey, non-divisional, you're okay there, but
yeah.
One of those things that's still fighting for a potential playoff bid in the NFC. You might not want it if sure.
Correct. And Minnesota actually graded out second in run stop win rate last week. Now that's not saying much against this Tampa Bay offensive line and their run offense in general. But it feels to me like on this side of the ball, Philly's going to have an opportunity to put up some points here. And if Flores does send the pressure and leaves those cornerbacks on islands, do I think Goddard's going to get the ball this game? Yes. But it would not surprise me at all to see multiple deep shots to A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith if Flores brings that heat.
It would make sense to go along with what we've seen in the betting market, some support for the underdog, some support for the over in this game, especially in the first half with the potential quick start, given what we've grown accustomed to from Philadelphia. Should be a fun one tonight, but for all those fantasy owners out there, DeAndre Swift and Dallas Goedert, if you have those 2 players on your roster, you may want to get them active despite lackluster performances. And quite frankly, Billy, I'm not sure lackluster did them justice last week, with Swift getting 2 touches and Dallas Goedert targeted all of 1 time in that 25-20 win for New England. From Thursday to the Sunday slate, and when we start to look at some of these games, we obviously have a ton of overreactions in the market. And this game, to a lesser extent, saw a little bit of that, at least on the open, where it was the Chiefs installed as a 2.5 point road favorite. Total on the game, 51, has remained consistent, but you have seen some money move this number through the key of 3 out to 3.5. Of course, it looks significantly better in terms of the Chiefs' difference-making personnel. Chris Jones signs his contract, said he'll be out there on Sunday. We're not sure exactly what that workload will look like. No knock on Chris Jones, but I can't imagine he keeps himself in the same physical shape year in, year out as Nick Bosa does. Meanwhile, Travis Kelce, a limited participate in Wednesday's practice, dealing with that deep bone bruise. As we talked about going into last week's game against the Lions, I mean, week 1 was the first time Chris Jones and Travis Kelce both did not play since becoming teammates back in 2016. But even with those absences, a catch here or a catch there from the Kansas City wide receiving room, and suddenly they're able to get the win. The defense held their own, only allowing 14 points since Detroit mustered 7 coming in off of that pick 6. You look at Mahomes, off a loss, tends to play pretty well, 13-3 career record, 42 touchdowns to 15 interceptions. But this is clearly a Jags team trending in the right direction. I mean, 8-1 versus the rest of the league over the last 11 games, just 0-2 against the Chiefs. And when we look at the playoff game, I mean, look, Patrick Mahomes did it on one leg, got the ball out of his hand quickly. Now he's got the luxury of mobility working on his side. And you have to think this Chiefs offense sees a path for success against the Jacksonville defense.
100%. And, we saw the video yesterday, I'm not sure if you saw, of Travis Kelce greeting Chris Jones at practice. And he ran.
I thought you were going to tell me about Travis Kelce video leaked on TMZ about his first date with Taylor Swift. So I'm glad you went after the Chris
I'll stay
Jones
away
angle.
from the Taylor Swift news. But, we saw that video of him, and he ran right up to Chris Jones, jumped off one leg, bumped into him, and landed right on the knee that's been hyperextended. So I think Travis Kelce's going to be fine, because I think a guy who would be hesitant about his knee would not be making that type of move. Before we get started on the offense, I'm not sure if you heard the Chris Jones quote when he was asked about whether he was not in football shape. He just goes, I don't know. So he's definitely going to be on a snap count.
I saw Chris Jones doing some of his charitable obligations with the team last week at Kansas City. I looked him up and down. I went, I'm not sure he's the definition of a full workout warrior. So I think realistically for me, if he logs more than 20 snaps against the Jags in non-passing situations or in third intermediates, I would actually be quite surprised.
Agreed there. But I'll take us back to the Kansas City offense. And look, Reed and Mahomes with more prep time. Obviously, the stats are out there. They've been phenomenal. We know Kelce's going to be there. He has been a Jaguar killer. He had 20 catches last year in the 2 matchups. Mahomes came out, said, I still have trust in Kadarius Toney. I don't know how much worse it can be for those Kansas City receivers than what it was in versus Detroit. They only had 2 players with positive catch percentages above expectation, which was Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Justin Ross. And when we look at the Jaguars' defense, they finished third in defensive DVOA, first in defensive rush EPA, but we have to consider what they were facing. I mean, Deion Jackson was running the football for Indianapolis. Anthony Richardson ended up being the leading rusher. And despite all that, the Jaguars still finished bottom 8 in both pass rush and run stop win rate. Colts finished 1 for 5 on 4th down attempts. This isn't the Colts you're facing. This is Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs offense with an extra 3 days. I think they're set up for some success here.
The craziest part about it, when you go back and watch the game for Kansas City and Detroit on Thursday night, we remember the drops. Obviously, Kadarius Toney has the ball go right through his hands that leads to that Lions defensive touchdown. But you dig into some of the numbers. Mahomes goes 2 of 12 for 12 yards and targeting wide receivers in the second half. It's the fewest yards per attempt by any quarterback targeting wide receiver in the second half of a game since 2000, and there were over 3,000 instances. So for all of those people out there citing a sample size, 3,000 I think is significantly enough in the NFL. But the crazy part about that, Billy, is in the first half, targeting wide receivers, his passer rating was north of 150. You have to imagine that with extra time to prepare, that Andy Reid, along with Matt Nagy and company, are going to be smart. Would it stun you at all if they go, you know what, the hell with it, we're going to throw the ball to Kadarius Toney 3 straight times on that opening drive, whether it's bubble screens, whether it's short passes, allow him to build his confidence, and suddenly you start to open up the rest of the playbook against this Jags team?
Not at all. I mean, we know Andy Reid is a player's coach, and we know he has a sense of humor. And wouldn't it be ironic after the Kadarius Toney outing against Detroit, in which he pretty much cost the Chiefs that game, with the ball going through his hands for the pick six, the drops in the fourth quarter, that game's pretty much on him. I think we're going to see him involved quite a bit. The other part of this matchup that's interesting is Juwan Taylor. Obviously, the refs are going to have their eye on him, making sure he's not lined up 2 yards in the backfield. But the bigger question / intriguing part of this game is he was with Jacksonville last year, and both of the defensive ends, Trayvon Walker, who had 4 pressures last week, which is an upgrade from last year. I think he was averaging just over 2 last year. And Josh Allen, who had 3 sacks. They both seem very comfortable and confident facing him. They've dealt with him in practice. Allen calls this a playoff game for the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'm not sure it's going to be enough to slow down Kansas City, but it is a matchup I'm going to be watching, is who's going to be getting the better of Juwan Taylor versus either of those defensive ends, because we know Kansas City has an elite offensive line. I don't think Jacksonville can do enough on the back end against, we saw what Anthony Richardson was able to do through the air. And with his limited weapons, I think Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, with his extra prep time, they're going to come correct.
Yeah, it's a fascinating matchup, and I'm glad you brought that up, trying to figure out exactly what kind of tells Jawan Taylor can point out to some of his offensive line compatriots there for Kansas City, for Josh Allen and Travon Walker, because you're exactly right. If this Jags team can't generate pressure from those rush end spots, I don't have the confidence in that secondary. For as improved as this Jags roster is and all the expectations about them running away and hiding with the AFC South, they do need to solidify, that defensive backfield should they become a legitimate contender as far as the AFC landscape is concerned. Now, when we look at the other side of the ball, we saw Press Taylor make his debut as the play caller in the Jags opener. Doug Peterson had nothing but a few praise to heap on him for that level of responsibility, saying, look, we didn't throw him to the wolves, essentially. He's been out there. He's done this in the past for halves. And when you look at what Peterson and Taylor did last year, the Jaguars showed market improvement year over year, improved from 32nd to 10th in points per game. They went from 28th to 8th in EPA per play, 19th to 5th in success rate, and 27th to 8th in DVOA. It obviously helps that you have a transcendent talent at the quarterback position in Trevor Lawrence, and we've seen some of that over the last 10 games of the regular season, going 8-2, 70% completions, and a touchdown interception ratio of 17-3, compared to what he did in his first 25 games with a lower completion percentage and one more interception compared to touchdowns. You look at this Jags offense matched up against Kansas City defensively. Where do you see potential edges that Peterson and Taylor can exploit? Is it ETN and Bigsby in the ground game, or with the addition of Calvin Ridley, who looked every bit as good as advertised in the opener, that you think the Jags are willing and able to attack a slightly underrated Kansas City defensive backfield?
That's where they have to attack. And you don't bring in Calvin Ridley to pair with Zay Jones and Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram and ETN out of the backfield. They are loaded up with speed and explosiveness at those skill positions. So I don't think we're going to see a game plan where, Tank Bigsby is going to get 10 carries and ETN is going to get 12 carries. I do like the Kansas City secondary in general. I think we're going to see L'Jarius Sneed get put on Ridley. He's got some extra size, and maybe he can get him off of his routes a little bit. I think the pass defensive unit's trending up for Kansas City. Like Trent McDuffie quite a bit. Joshua Williams is coming into his own. Look, they held Detroit, a very efficient Detroit offense last year, to 14 points, and they didn't have Chris Jones. They have good health on that side of the ball. All that being said, I think Jacksonville has a chance for success here regardless, because I think they're an offense that we're going to look back on at the end of the year and go, this offense can score against any defense. But the one concern, Todd, I have, you guys talked about it on the preseason preview with Jacksonville, is the offensive line. And what happened? They lost Brandon Scherf. He's dealing with an ankle sprain. They call him day-to-day. If he's out there, it didn't sound good. It didn't sound positive.
It didn't sound good. I'm right there.
It didn't sound positive. So Tyler Shatley's the backup, and that is the concern. It's not that the Chiefs have this dominant defensive line, though. The defensive line played pretty well against an elite Detroit offensive line last week. But can they get to Trevor enough to get him rolling out of the pocket? And maybe struggling to find Ridley or Zay Jones or Kirk. This could be a game, though, I can see Evan Ingram and ETN out of the backfield getting plenty of looks.
No, it makes sense. They're going to have to figure out ways, if Kansas City is able to generate pressure, to get the ball to some of their playmakers, use screens to slow down that potential pass rush. But it's always interesting when we look at Kansas City, and we know the trademark of Spagnuolo's, NASCAR packages, so to speak. He loves to play with lighter boxes, drop guys into coverage. And I think Calvin Ridley, no doubt, caught a lot of us by surprise with how sharp he looked right out of the gates. But I have a feeling, Billy, a lot of talented wide receivers are going to make that Colts secondary look like they're out there with a matador defense more often than not, and we'll see this weekend for the Colts how they fare against the Houston Texans and a young quarterback. So I'm with you there. When you look at the total, have you seen anything in the betting market? I know the number hasn't moved, but any angles that you've looked to try and attack in this particular game thus far?
So the total got touched up a little bit. It opened 50 and a half at a couple spots. We're out to that key of 51. And personally, there's a lean for this Kansas City team total over at 27. This is a low team total for a Chiefs offense that I think we look back in week one and it was very clear that the drops cost them a bunch of points, but Kelsey's going to be back. And I don't think this Jags defense is a top top half unit right now, especially in the back end of that secondary. So that's the way I'm looking right now, is there could be potential with that Kansas City team total to go over 27.
Look, we've seen this team bounce back a ton, and when you look at history, obviously, good teams don't typically start 0-2, but when they do, they don't make the playoffs all that often. You have roughly a 12% success rate of teams doing that in a significant sample size. The Cincinnati Bengals accomplished the feat last year, and by no way, shape, or form am I saying Kansas City, with all of their talent, starting 0-2 is a death knell, but I'm sure you will get them at their best, and that mini-bye, clearly something that Andy Reid and company will take full advantage of, knowing that the roster should have a few more weapons that weren't available to them in their season opener against the Detroit Lions. You can follow Billy on X. I guess I can't call it Twitter anymore. At Watt05. I'm sure I butchered that. Sorry. It's Watt_05. I don't want people looking around and trying to go, where the hell are we going to find this guy? You can read all of Billy's great work at Bet the Board. He does outstanding stuff when it comes to Pythagorean win totals before the year starts. When he decides he wants to contribute an article during the course of the season, the content's great, oftentimes lends itself to additional best bets in some of those derivative markets that usually aren't widely available when we go through our normal recording. And he's been a member of the Bet the Board family for quite some time. We just decided that this was the best window to call him up to the big leagues and allow people to hear those dulcet tones as we broke down some of the games. Billy, when we look at the AFC, another matchup, this one within the division, though, in the AFC North, early on Sunday in a 1 o'clock Eastern time slot. The Cincinnati Bengals, a modest field goal favorite. You do have to lay $1.20. Total on this game sits at 46.5. We've seen a little bit of a battle there. The Bengals have become the first team since 2005, when the Jets did it, to be favored in week 2 despite coming into the game off a 15-plus point loss versus a team that had a dominant win. Why is that important? Public perception, as we talk about until we're blue in the face, oftentimes plays a bigger role in the NFL than it does any of the other sports out there that people are looking to try and bet. The Ravens, interestingly enough, when we dig into some of the series history, they became just the third team since 1950 to start 3 different quarterbacks versus one opponent in a season, joining the illustrious 1965 Baltimore Colts and the 1990 Washington Redskins. When we look at the Cincinnati Bengals, because of a scheduling quirk here, this will be the 3rd straight home game for them, all against the Baltimore Ravens. Week 18, the playoffs, and then week 2 right here. As far as Lamar Jackson, a tough nut to crack when he's installed as an underdog. 8-4 outright. And the second best winning record by a quarterback since 1970 with a minimum of 10 starts, behind only Jimmy Garoppolo. And Jackson went on to say himself, and I quote, "I love being the underdog. I really don't care to be hyped up or people displaying that we're on top of the league. I'd rather be the underdog because we always have something to prove. We always have a chip on our shoulder to go out there and win a game." The Ravens, they've lived up to that expectation, 19-3 against the spread as an organization when they're catching points. However, when we look at this game, Billy, trends are fine and well, but this Baltimore Ravens team on both the offensive and defensive side going to look a little bit different on Sunday than they did in their season opening win against the Houston Texans.
If you're a Ravens fan, this has to be so annoying because it happens every year. And it seems like, Todd, and I know you can speak to this, but it seems like every preseason, Baltimore garners some sharp professional action to the over, at least in the previous couple seasons. And by week 4, half the secondary's injured and 3/4 of the O-line's gone. And it just, I don't know what it is. I feel bad for this team, but it's a great transition to this offense and what we're looking at, especially on the injury front. You know, they worked out 4 offensive linemen on Wednesday because it looks like Tyler Linderbaum and Ronnie Stanley's not going to be able to go. And we already lost J.K. Dobbins for the year. That guy can't catch a break. So it looks like Patrick McCarry's going to be at tackle versus taking on Trey Hendrickson, which is big advantage for Cincinnati.
Suboptimal if you're a Ravens fan.
Very suboptimal. Former Bears center Sam Mustipher is going to start there. But the bigger question I have is, what do we make of Todd Monken's offense? Because for me, I was not impressed. Something seemed off, and when I dug into some of the metrics, Lamar only had 4.6 air yards per attempt, which was the second lowest of his career. He averaged over 8 for his career. Now, he was 15 for 15 with a clean pocket and no Mark Andrews, which is impressive. But something was going on there. And again, this is a weather game. You don't want to take too much from a week 1 game that carried a ton of rain. But what did you see from the Monken offense that led you to think they could be having long success here?
Look, I think anytime that you have a quarterback that's grown accustomed to running one system, as we saw with Lamar Jackson and Greg Roman, there's inevitably going to be a learning curve. And I think you highlighted some of the issues here that get lost in such a dominant final scoreline in terms of what Lamar Jackson did or didn't do. It's all well and good when you're operating from a clean pocket. We expect players performing in the National Football League to go out there and put up numbers. But I was surprised that he was as erratic as he was in a little bit of those scramble situations, dealing with pressure. The fact that they didn't really stretch the field, even with a tremendous breakout performance in his first NFL game from Zay Flowers, but Odell Beckham Jr. kind of an afterthought. Your point about not having your security blanket and Mark Andrews, you wonder how different the offense looks. But for me, it's kind of that wait and see approach, and it's one thing to do it at home, even in inclement weather, against the Houston Texans defense, and compared to going on the road, taking on a team that was embarrassed in their season opener, one with a high level of familiarity, even if Lamar's had success against this Bengals team in the past. And I think, somewhere along the way, you're going to wait to see the light go on, if it does, for the way Lamar commands Todd Monken's offense. And no different than, what we'll talk about in the Dolphins game, that, look, it takes a little while to implement a scheme, whether it's on the offensive or defensive side, before things click. Now, as terms of Baltimore and what that backfield will look like, you mentioned the injuries along the offensive line. J.K. Dobbins, the most explosive runner, gone. I don't think Melvin Gordon factors in whatsoever. We know what Gus Edwards is. We know what Justice Hill is. And I don't think either of those two backs truly scares you a ton, given the workload. So if you're the Bengals, you're looking to key in on Lamar. You're going to force him to prove he can beat you as a pocket passer. And we'll see how some of that typically unfolds. When you look at this Bengals defense, what were some of your expectations for the group as a collective coming into the season?
I was higher on them, I think, than the market, even though they had the losses of Bates and Bell at the safety position. I like Dax Hill a lot. I think he showed very well in that first game. Again, though, that first game against Cleveland, we have to factor in how bad that weather was, because Deshaun Watson missed some throws where guys were clearly open. There could have been some big gains, and he just didn't hit them. The run defense struggled mightily to keep Nick Chubb in check. Now, you're going up against maybe one of the best offensive line running back combos in the league, and now you're going to take on Baltimore, who notably is a very strong run team, but only 15% of their rushes last week gained 5 or more yards, which was the worst in the NFL. And I'm slightly higher on Houston Texans defense, especially under D'Amico. I think they have a lot of room to grow, and I think they're going to get there. But Baltimore, they have to be better. If Lamar's only averaging 4.6 air yards per attempt, and only 15% of your rushes are gaining 5 or more yards, and now you're going into a desperate Cincinnati team with a fantastic defensive coordinator, Lou Anarumo, I think it's an uphill battle. And I wanted to like Baltimore here. Personally, before this week, the week 1 games kicked off, I thought this was going to be a good spot for Baltimore. I don't feel that way anymore, especially on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, look, it's a fluid situation. When you try and figure out where you may have a matchup advantage to exploit, obviously the market offers up some interesting context clues, and it's not just the Ravens on the offensive line or in the backfield that are banged up. There are some defensive injuries they have to contend with, and why is that important? We're going to go to a Pittsburgh Steelers head coach for a pretty interesting quote that we got from Mike Tomlin after he watched the tape of the Cleveland Browns dominating the Cincinnati Bengals last week. And his quote, to be blunt, I thought the corners won the game for them last week. Tomlin said, according to Chris Easterling of the Akron Beacon Journal, their ability to stand on the line of scrimmage and challenge the Cincinnati Bengals I thought was really impressive. They stood up time and time again. It allowed their safeties and linebackers to get focused on Bengals running back Joe Mixon and some of the run game. I thought that was the catalyst for the performance. Well, why is that important? Billy, the Baltimore Ravens secondary ain't exactly a model of health by any stretch of the imagination. And when we want to give Denzel Ward and Martin Emerson all the gold stars in the world for what they did in weather to T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, I have to imagine Mother Nature may smile much more fondly upon this Bengals receiving core in week 2 than what we saw out of them from productivity level in week 1.
Yeah, so this defensive secondary for Baltimore, in going into the season, we already said this was kind of a thin unit, and they really couldn't afford a lot of injuries. And I say thin in terms of talent. They had a lot of secondary guys on the roster, but talent-wise, it wasn't the strongest Baltimore secondary we've seen. Now you're down Marlon Humphrey, who didn't play already, but there was hope he might be able to go for this one. He's not going to be there. Safety Marcus Williams tore his pec, debating on whether or not he's going to have surgery. He's not going to be there. They signed Jaron Harmon off the practice squad. And when we look at these cornerbacks for Baltimore, our Darius Washington, who is more of a slot guy, he graded very well in coverage last week. He's going to be out there with, it looks like Ronald Darby and Brandon Stevens are going to be cornerback 1 and 2, with Rock Ya-Sin filling in where he needs to be. But this is a giant challenge for this secondary, especially when you consider they're not facing Tank Dell and this Houston passing offense. They're going up against probably a top 5 passing offense, top 3 passing offense in all of football. And the health on the Cincinnati offensive side of the ball seems very well. Obviously, it was an embarrassing performance week 1, but how much of that was really due to the weather? I think we're going to see Cincinnati bounce back here in a big way on the offensive side of the ball.
When you look at some of Joe Burrow's numbers, a career low in completion percentage, 45%, passing yards, 82, was actually the fewest passing yards by any quarterback with 30-plus attempts since Ryan Lindley accomplished the feat back in 2012. Fewest team yards, yards per play, and first downs for a Joe Burrow-led offense in his career, tied for the fewest team points as well at 3. So not exactly positive indicators, albeit an opportunity to buy low on a quarterback that was a little bit hobbled in terms of his mobility. But the bigger question that I have for you with the Bengals, Billy, how concerned should we be about an offensive line that was a question mark last year? They benefited immensely when they went to Western New York and the Bills weren't able to rush the quarterback in the snow, but showed some kinks in the armor as well in the season opener against the Browns, and earlier this week made news letting La'el Collins go, clearly illustrating to the rest of the world and indicating, look, we don't need that particular depth piece. We believe that cap room is better allocated elsewhere.
I'm not concerned. And, you're looking at the metrics from last week. They were 31st in pass block win rate, 32nd in run block win rate, and 31st in adjusted line yards. But there's a couple factors here. 1, the weather was terrible. 2, I'm really high on this Cleveland defensive line. And I love Jim Schwartz as a coordinator. And I think that line is going to cause problems no matter which offensive line they face. We're talking about an offensive line for Cincinnati. Doesn't get many preseason reps. They're very stingent on putting guys out there and playing them during the preseason. And again, look back to last year. They started very slow against the Pittsburgh defensive line and the Dallas defensive line. I think the cutting of La'el Collins says everything you just said. And they're very comfortable with their offensive line. And they have faith in them moving forward to get it going as the season goes on. So was it the best data point last week? No. Am I running, to go bet Cincinnati unders because of it? No, absolutely not. I think they're going to figure it out. I think Burrow's that dude. And remember last year, they kind of switched their offense halfway through the year to start doing what Joe really wanted to do, was lining up in shotgun and getting the ball out quick. They'll do whatever's necessary to get this figured out. I'm not concerned.
Yeah, I think, when you get a performance as poor as it was last week for the Bengals, and of course coming against a team that's quite frankly owned Joe Burrow during his very short career in the Cleveland Browns, there's a lot of self-scouting that goes on. You try and figure out exactly which way that you want to attack an opposing defense, and given some of the injuries in the secondary that you highlighted, I think the Bengals will have a wealth of options at their disposal to get the ball to T. Higgins. He's not going to be targeted 8 times with 0 catches. Jamar Chase won't just go 4 for 39. And I think, when you look at some of the other weapons they have there, that we know the Cincinnati Bengals can get themselves right, and maybe this is a spot against a division rival, because the last thing you want to be doing this early in the campaign is staring down the barrel of an 0-2 start. Speaking of 0-2 starts, neither of the teams in the next game were going to have an 0-2 start, regardless of how things go on Sunday. When we look at a matchup that obviously had all the star power in the world between the Jets and Cowboys, it loses a little bit of its luster with Aaron Rodgers' unfortunate injury on Monday Night Football. But we're looking at the Cowboys now a 9-point favorite at home. Total in the game, 38.5. And this As far as market context, you were looking at Dallas right around a 3.5-point favorite, total in that 45, 45.5, 46 range with Rodgers, but things adjust. I don't think this game warrants a full, comprehensive deep dive, but I do want to try and figure out exactly what Aaron Rodgers' absence means to you, not only for the Jets this week, but in the more macro context as well, as far as their adjusted win total, their prospects to win the division, get to the playoffs. And we know it's a much maligned fan base. They were already making plans to spend the middle of February in Las Vegas. They may need to temper some of those expectations with AR-12 being lost for the season to a torn Achilles, only 4 snaps in.
Tempering, yeah, temper those expectations, Jets fans. So I do quarterback ratings. I have every quarterback rated, and I had a downgrade from Rodgers to Wilson somewhere between 6.8 and 7.1 points to a power rating. And when we look at the win total, they closed at some of the sharper shops before the season. The under, it was 9.5 with the under shaded at about -120, -125. Now they start 1-0 in a game that they were a dog, and their win total is 8.5 under -160. And I think that kind of says enough for what the expectations are for Zach Wilson. Robert Saleh's come out very boldly and just said, this is our guy and this is what we're going to do. That's fine, but you're going to have to open up this offense a little bit if you're really going to reach the ceiling of where this team can go with Zach Wilson. I understand game one, conservative nature with the Rodgers injury and probably an entirely different game plan than the one you had with Zach Wilson. But we just saw it's a 13-13 game with 2 minutes to go, 1st and 10, and they went run at the end of the Bills game to kick that field goal to go up 16-13. The other thing with Zach Wilson being the quarterback now is, what do you think of Nathaniel Hackett as a play caller? Because he was brought in really to get Rodgers on board. And they know that if Hackett's there as OC, Rodgers is going to have a lot of say in that offense, and he can be audibling whatever he feels. But now we're going to see how good Nathaniel Hackett is as a play caller with just Zach Wilson there. And with an O-line that finished 32nd last week in pass block win rate against a very good Bills D-line, step it up in class this week because you're playing the best pass rushing defensive line in football. So I'm interested to see if Dallas is just going to pin their ears back and get after Zach.
Well, let's get into some of those matchups. And I think when we look at strength on strength, look, this Cowboys defense probably gets overlooked because of some of the star power, pun intended, that they have on the offensive side. So rather than looking at Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, Tony Pollard and company against that very talented Jets defense, we'll do a deep dive on the other side of the ball and lay out some numbers here that you can take any which way. When we look at the Jets offensive rankings, Jets fans may want to cover their ears from 2022 because none of these numbers are good by any stretch of the imagination. There is no silver lining, and you may be reliving a nightmare that you had to endure over the latter portion of last season's schedule. The Jets finished last year 25th in total yards per game, tied for 25th in rushing yards, 27th in penalty yards, 28th in third down conversion percentage, 29th in points per game, 29th in takeaways, 31st in red zone scoring percentage, which won't go up, obviously, if you continue to run on 1st and 10 inside the red zone, 31st in red zone touchdown percentage. Now, I guess there is a little bit of a silver lining when we look at the Jets. They get Breece Hall back in the mix, and Breece Hall has been a cheat code when he's been out there with over 100-plus scrimmage yards per game since entering the league. That places him in rarefied air along the likes of Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Christian McCaffrey, and Nick Chubb. And we saw what Breece Hall was able to do last week, even on a surgically repaired knee, showed that burst, showed the big play potential, and the Jets were 6-2 when Hall was in the mix last year, so he was kind of the guy and a crutch, so to speak, that Zach Wilson could lean on. We'll see exactly how Garrett Wilson gets involved. But they're matched up in this spot, Billy, against a Cowboys defense that takes no prisoners. They shut out the Giants in week 1. That's neither here nor there, but they're looking for the back-to-back shutouts for the second time in franchise history. Since Dan Quinn took over, this defense has been the definition of opportunistic. 70 takeaways, 102 sacks, a pressure rate north of 40, 243 points off turnovers, and 10 defensive touchdowns, tied for the most with New England. Zach Wilson and the Jets, you mentioned Nathaniel Hackett. I wish you nothing but good luck and good health if the Cowboys defense looks as fast, as healthy, as athletic as what we saw on Sunday Night Football.
Yeah, you mentioned it with Dan Quinn. He has that defense playing just so downhill and aggressive. And they have the athletic freaks on the defensive line and in the secondary to do so. The one thing, though, that I'll mention, and you talked about Breece Hall, he looked incredible. I mean, that was so impressive coming off that injury and running the way he did. Pro Football Focus graded the Jets as the number 1 run blocking unit off their performance last week. They were 7th in adjusted line yards. They were 2nd in offensive rush EPA. I think there's a path to success against the Dallas run defense. We knew last year in the playoffs that was a concern, the interior defensive line not being able to stop the run. What do? They go out, they draft Mozzie Smith for a reason. We saw the opening script that Dayball and Kafka used, and they were running Barkley right up the middle, and they did so with success. Dallas graded out 16th in defensive rush EPA and 29th in defensive rush success rate last week. So I think the Jets can have success here. The only issue is, will Dallas even be intimidated at all by Zach Wilson and what he can bring to the pass game? Because if they're not, they will load that box and they will be playing downhill quickly. So Hackett's going to need to threaten the deep play. And we'll see who's going to be matched up with Garrett Wilson. But I think some go routes here, some stop and goes, is exactly what they need to get them backed off so then they can implement this run game.
Look, I know oftentimes we've seen from the Jets and the defensive DNA in their head coach, Robert Saleh. I'd love nothing more than the Jets on the opening series, obviously depending on where that drive starts and working under the assumption that it won't be in the shadow of their own end zone, to run play action. If you see safety sneaking into the box to try and take away Breece Hall, get Garrett Wilson on the outside, whether it's against Trevon Diggs or Stephon Gilmore, and look to isolate him one-on-one. Take that deep shot. Even if it's incomplete, it shows that it's something in the arsenal that if Dallas wants to sell out and stop the run, and then on the flip side, if the Jets are able to connect on that, I think the entire playbook is right there at their disposal. But you're exactly right, and I know a lot of people want to throw the baby out with the bathwater given the final score, and it wasn't pretty for the Giants at 40-0, but that game turned as much on the opening drive as any other game that we saw. If the Giants are able to manufacture points there, you don't get the bad snap from John Michael Schmitz in his NFL debut over Daniel Jones and the subsequent block field goal that turns into a defensive/special teams touchdown for the Cowboys, maybe that game takes on a very different tenor, and it's not as though that the Cowboys offense in bad weather went out there and lit up a far inferior Giants defense compared to the stop unit they're going to face this week, knowing that the gauntlet has been thrown down and a lot more will be expected of the Jets defense now without Aaron Rodgers, realizing they're going to have to win a lot more football games 2017 than track meets in the 30s.
Yeah, so the Dallas offense, when we looked at what went on in that Giants game, they had no pressure. They had no pressure to perform. And, they did so. They didn't have Tyler Smith in that game. And they played with a giant lead in this rain game where the Giants really kind of struggled to keep Pollard in check. And now they get to go up against a real defense, a defense that has the ability to be elite. And Jets finished 7th in run stop win rate and rush EPA last week. And obviously we know the talent in the secondary. So there is going to be more pressure on Dallas to get things going on that side of the ball, which I'm personally excited to see what they bring to the table here. But there's no doubt about it, this is a big step up for them. And it's a big test, even as a 9-point favorite right now, to put some stuff together on the offensive side of the ball.
Injury games can be tricky, and while you don't have anything situational working in your favor to try and make a case for the Jets here, with Dallas having a road trip to take on the vaunted Cardinals on deck, I'm very curious to see exactly what the Jets offense looks like with a full week to prepare against this Cowboys team. You have to imagine sportsbooks will have a ton of liability going to Dallas Cowboys moneyline parlays and 7-point teasers through the key. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how this dynamic plays out. But Jets fans, be prepared. The Zach Wilson Experience Chapter 3 gets going in earnest with a full week to prepare against the Dallas Cowboys. And the final game, Billy, on the Sunday slate is in Foxborough, where we'll see the Miami Dolphins and the New England Patriots do battle. Miami comes into this spot as a full field goal road favorite. That's up substantially from the opener, where they were a 2-point favorite. We heard Payne have an aneurysm on air during Monday's show, talking about a total that got bet up in real time. Well, the numbers come back, and we're right back where this thing opened at 46.5. Miami in an unenviable spot of having to travel to the West Coast last week. Not a true short week, but they'll travel up to New England for this spot. Meanwhile, the Patriots acquitted themselves quite nicely despite coming up short in a 25-20 loss against the Philadelphia Eagles. And this will mark the first Sunday night game between the Dolphins and Patriots going back to 1991. And the de facto Alabama quarterback round robin continues here as Mac Jones went up against Jalen Hurts last week, goes up against Tua Tagovailoa this week. As far as Tua is concerned, he's had some success when it comes to dealing with a Bill Belichick-led defense. 4-0 in his career versus the Patriots, and the Finns are looking for their second consecutive 2-0 start for the first time since the early 2000s. The Pats, meanwhile, boast the dubious distinction of having the longest ATS losing streak, now at 5 games, coming up just short last week. When we look at this Patriots team offensively, Billy, I know 20 points doesn't have people comparing them to the greatest show on turf, led by the St. Louis Rams back in the day, but I saw market improvement from New England that gives me a little bit more optimism that this actually looks like a group that could trend in the right direction compared to that abomination and dumpster fire we saw last year under Matt Patricia's tutelage.
No doubt. And they did so without many key cogs in that offensive line. Onwenu wasn't available. Cole Strange didn't go. Neither did right tackle Riley Reif. And it doesn't seem to be getting any better for them this week as Trent Brown and Sidney Sow are still in concussion protocol. But it was really impressive to see Mac Jones with these limited weapons. He obviously has Demario Douglas out there, who 6th rounder out of Liberty. Payne mentioned him on the offseason pod. But he seems to be a dude for them. He had 4 catches for 40 yards, but he was constantly put in routes that were getting him open. And they had success despite, Kayshon Boutte out of LSU. He had the 2 unfortunate sideline, couldn't get his feet down. Those were game-changing incompletions because the Patriots definitely could have won that football game. Now, though, Boutte's dealing with a hamstring injury. Devontae Parker is dealing with a knee injury. So it's where are they going to go on offensive side of the ball here? They got to get Juju more involved.
Yeah, I mean, look, I thought Juju was going to factor a little bit more prominently into the game plan. If you'd have told me the Patriots lose 25-20 and it's Kendrick Bourne essentially emerging as the alpha male in the receiving room, I'd have told you needed to be drug tested. Ezekiel Elliott showed a little bit of burst in his own right, was more efficient as a runner than what they got out of Ramondre Stevenson. Stevenson added a lot more value as a receiver, which we talked about as well in the preseason preview about how he could kind of be that 3-down back. That, of course, was before Elliott was signed. And when you look at Mac Jones, look, 35 completions and 54 attempts were the most among any player in week 1. Had his first ever 3 passing touchdown, 300-yard performance. And I think what stood out to me as well was that 51 of his 52 pass attempts came from the shotgun, with only 7 plays, 6 runs coming from under center. However, with the good comes the bad, and Jones finished with a completion percentage over expected of minus 3.3%, despite having a relatively short target depth of 7.2 yards. He was 10-19 for 80 yards, with a touchdown while under pressure on his dropbacks. Average time to throw, even behind an offensive line that was more patchwork, 2.52 seconds. So not great, not terrible. But you saw the decisiveness, I guess, was what stood out to me. And while I know it's more difficult to quantify, you watch Ryan Tannehill, stood in the pocket like a deer in headlights, wasn't sure where to go with it. Mac Jones, at least, felt like he understood what this offense is meant to do. Got a player like Hunter Henry involved. And I think the more and more comfortable he gets in a scheme that may be a little bit more cerebral, this is a Patriots offense that once they get their health will have a path to success, especially knowing that Miami wasn't exactly buttoned up defensively in their debut under Vic Fangio, given the complexities of the kind of defenses they want to run.
Yeah, you brought up a great point with Mac Jones. He looked extremely comfortable. And he looked extremely comfortable against an elite D-line. And that brings us to Miami, who on paper, you got Phillips, you got Wilkins, you got Seiler, you got Chubb. They were excellent against the run last year. What happened in week 1? Because they were 32nd in defensive rush EPA, 32nd in run stop win rate. Joshua Kelly and Austin Eckler ran wild on them. So this isn't like New England's now going to take on, they're going to look at Miami's defensive line and go, oh, well, now we're facing real talent. You just faced probably the best, outside of Dallas, maybe the best defensive line in football in Philadelphia. So I have some questions with this Miami defensive line. Again, it's week 1. You don't want to overreact. Who knows what Fangio's, what he really wanted to do in that game, if he was more concerned with the back end secondary and didn't mind giving up some runs. But there's definitely some questions I have for Miami. I'm a big Fangio believer, but that defensive line, they came through late. They got the pressure on Herbert and forced those sacks. But what was going on with the run? Because I think despite having most likely a very injured offensive line this week, I think New England's going to be able to run the football if they choose to do so.
We mentioned the offensive line at the top, and I was remiss in not kind of following up there. Obviously, we're going to monitor the injury report, and when you go through it, it's never a good thing when all 5 starters are limited or DNPs on a Wednesday for practice. There is the possibility that David Andrews, Onwenu and Cole Strange could be upgraded, so they could get those guys back. We'll see if the 2 players in concussion protocol are healthy. As far as cluster injuries and making an adjustment to the overall number here for you, if all 5 of those guys are out, if 3 of those guys are out, a half point, a full point, or do you think this number could trend even further knowing that the public remembers what they saw last? It's a standalone game on Sunday Night Football, and there's a real possibility if New England continues to be banged up there that you may get this number out to 3.5.
2 things here. And something we haven't talked about yet, but the Wednesday injury reports, and we've that's all the data we have right now. They're not guys sit out Wednesdays all the time. So listeners,
I've tried to do that. People won't allow it around these parts.
Listeners can take this for what it is, but Wednesday injury reports, you don't want to put too much into them. Now with concussions, that's a different story because the league is trending towards being very careful with concussions, and we've seen a couple of these New England offensive linemen with concussions. But Todd, I think the market has kind of said what they think about this game and these injuries. Miami was bet out to -3 on Wednesday with the news of the offensive line issues and likely return of their own offensive lineman, Teron Armstead. If we see New England down 3 to 4 of their starting offensive linemen, I do think this is going to leak out to 3.5. But if this got out to 4, I think we're going to see an appetite for New England.
Look, everybody's got their buy point here, and I'm sitting trying to figure out, do I want to get involved at +3 now and add to my position if it got to 3.5? Because I think from a situational standpoint and some of the matchups that you're looking at, I mean, it's New England or pass in this particular spot. Obviously, things can change a little bit, but you mentioned, the other side of the ball a little bit. And when we look at Miami's offensive firepower, I mean, a record-setting performance out of the gates. Tua throws for 466. It's the 4th most in a season opener in NFL history. Tyreek Hill goes for 215 yards, his 9th career game with 175 plus, 2nd most in the NFL history, behind Lance Allworth. Led the NFL in yards as a team, the Dolphins, with 536 yards per play, 8.2 last week, and 25-plus yard plays with 6 of them in week 1. We saw the connection with Tyreek Hill typically heats up after the break as those guys get stronger as the game goes. But in step the New England Patriots, and they haven't exactly shut down Tyreek Hill, but they've had more success than most teams. Tyreek hasn't recorded 100 more receiving yards in either of his last 5 games versus New England, and including the playoffs. He had 4 catches of 20-plus yards alone versus the Chargers. The rest of the NFL had 29 in that particular variety. But when we look at the Patriots, I mean, this is a team that really limits the big play over the top. Jalen Waddle, not 100%, was a limited participant dealing with an oblique injury. But the Patriots want to make you play left-handed, and Tua, if they go out there, and I'm not saying they can't win, it's not going to be because Tyreek Hill goes absolutely nuclear like he did last week against Brandon Staley in that Chargers secondary.
Correct. And, you watch Miami against the Chargers, and it just feels like a cheat code. Especially when you think about Tyreek and Waddle, and McDaniel's so smart because he gets them in motion before the snap. And one of the Chargers cornerbacks came out, I forgot which one it was, but said, it just feels like you're already behind the 8 ball because they're running. They're running in motion, and now you're chasing the fastest guy on the field. Tua was phenomenal last week, and the offense was phenomenal. They had one punt with every other drive resulting in points outside of a fumble at the 2-yard line and a jump ball to Braxton Berrios in the end zone in the third quarter, which that was interesting to see there. But he was first in drop back. Braxton Berrios, not my number one guy for a jump ball in the end zone, but
yeah, I'm not running corner fades on a regular basis to Braxton Berrios. So if I want a wingman and I'm going out in South Beach on a Saturday night during the spring, Berrios might be my number one pick, but not to run a fade route from inside the red zone.
And, Tua was first in drop back EPA. They averaged 8.2 yards per play. And that was despite a run offense that was just 30th in rush EPA. So it's not like they were running the ball with a ton of success. What I did see this in week 1 that we didn't see last year was they got the tight ends involved. They got Durham Smythe involved, who's a great blocking tight end, but he was open in the pass game. They targeted him 7 times. Tua's press conference yesterday was awesome when he was asked about his deep ball strength, and he just said 466. Like, you tell me about my deep ball. And is there valid questions to Tua's arm strength? Yes. But his anticipations might be the best in the league, and you're seeing it week in and week out. The one thing I'll say about this matchup, though, and when I was breaking down the Minnesota-Philadelphia game, was Philadelphia allowed more pressures last week against New England in bad weather, in rain weather, which usually makes it tougher on those defensive line to get up the field. But they allowed more pressures than any other game they did last year. And we knew this New England defensive line was going to be the strength of the unit. They showed out. Rookie Keon White out of Georgia Tech, he only played 13 snaps, but he had 4 pressures. They have dudes on this defensive line, and they're going to challenge Miami here. I just don't know. I don't know if they can keep Miami locked up here. It feels like Miami is a football team who, anytime you get a team total under 24, you just have to auto bet it because these guys are they're freaks, and they have an excellent guy calling plays for them in Mike McDaniel.
I mean, look, the Patriots are going to have to score. There's no doubt about it. Offensively, they're going to have to go out there and execute. You can't come up with empty drives in the fourth quarter and crunch time like we saw against Philadelphia, but should be a fascinating chess match. Miami, obviously, a team that suddenly, by virtue of Buffalo losing to the Jets, the injury to Aaron Rodgers, has moved to the forefront in terms of odds, slightly shorter than the Buffalo Bills. I look at New England, though, and they didn't exactly get the best hand dealt to them in terms of early season schedule, but I was surprised in the betting market to see their win total that closed 7.5 shaded to the under, a near miss against Philadelphia when you're a 3.5-point home underdog, and their adjusted win total down a full game to 6.5. I don't want to run before I learn to walk, but I am mildly intrigued by exploring the Patriots because I think their schedule softens up a little bit after this particular game, and the situation, if they're able to get a win against the Miami Dolphins, we could be looking at the Patriots team taking on Zach Wilson in week 2, taking on the Cowboys, not exactly soft landing spots by any stretch, but a home game against the Saints and a road game against the Raiders. So another data point to see exactly what Mac Jones will look like leading this Bill O'Brien offense.
One more thing, Todd, too. One more thing before we get away from this game. And you guys touched on it on Monday, and we're looking at it now, but the total got absolutely smashed from 45.5, 46. It got out to Chris, a very sharp, reputable offshore book, to 48.5. We saw the under money come back on Tuesday and Wednesday based on these, what I believe to be the reports on the New England offensive line. And we're now sitting at 46.5. I think the next move is going to tell us everything about this total and where it's going to head. I envision it likely heading north. I think we're more likely to get to 48 than a flat 45. But if New England's down 5 offensive linemen, I'm interested. It wouldn't surprise me to see them maybe go a little more run heavy in this game, and that could be why we saw this total get back down.
Yeah, I think if that's the case, you're exactly right, that you have to play more ball control. It's a lot more checkdowns, getting the ball to Ramondre Stevenson, which may bring his reception props and numbers into the mix here. Because when you look at it, we saw it last week, and I know weather played a little bit of a role. The Patriots took under money in their game. Hell, the Chargers and Dolphins game took under money there on game day as well. So you can learn a little bit about the betting market and some of professional bettors' tendencies. And with the rash of unders we saw on full display in week 1, you can understand why there's some skepticism about there being a lot of track meet football on full display in week 2. You can follow Billy on X at Watt_05. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there as well. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. If you haven't already subscribed to the Bet the Board podcast newsletter, I'm not sure what you're waiting for. It's quick, it's easy, it's right to your inbox on Friday. A recap of everything we've done around the site from our talented team of contributors, along with an additional best bet, one that got you to the window with a little bit more of a sweat, only because of one carry late on Jamal Williams' longest rush under 12.5 yards. He saved his best for last with an 11-yard carry, which cemented the Saints' victory. But Billy, you got big shoes to fill over there on that side of the table as it comes to the best bet portion of the program. I know you've essentially bet the board. You lived up to the podcast name with some of the grocery lists that you sent both Payne and I earlier this week. But where are you looking to go with the best bet for our listeners in terms of the most actionable elements for week 2?
Yeah, let's go to game 278. Cincinnati -3, -120. I would play this out to -125, and they are out there. It's really fascinating when you think about the market on this game. And it kind of speaks to the betting market in 2023 as opposed to maybe 5 years ago, 2018. The look ahead on this game was Cincinnati -3.5. And the two things that needed to happen for this price to open under the 3, even at potentially 1.5 or 2, happened. Baltimore won and covered, maybe not in the dominant fashion that we would expect, but they bucked some of the strong week 1 double-digit underdog trends. And then the other side, since he goes and lays an absolute egg, Burrow throws for 82 yards, they get 6 first downs, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, this line's going to open 1.5 or 2. Nope. We see 2.5 -120, and what happens? It immediately gets bet out to 3, and now we're trending towards 3.5. And again, I think this just comes down to the injuries. You got the two best key secondary cogs go down for Baltimore. Dobbins is out for the year. 2 starting offensive linemen trending towards not playing. And we're sitting back here at 3 -120, some 3.5. One book's trading a 4. But it kind of speaks to the sharpness of the market and what we expect to happen in this game, since he should be able to score here.
Yeah, you think a bounce-back game is in the cards. T. Higgins and Jamar Chase merely afterthoughts in the inclement weather against the Browns. I thought you raised some great points talking about the challenges that I think a lot of teams are going to face going up against the Browns this season with the additions they made along the defensive line, with how talented their corners can be in coverage, some underrated safety play in the back end, and, of course, an upgraded defensive coordinator to Jim Schwartz. So one data point for the Bengals, no reason to panic. You go out there and struggle this week against the Ravens secondary, breaking in some fresh faces and guys that are a little bit past their prime in key spots against one of the best receiving corps in the league, then you can be worried. But the Cincinnati Bengals, -3, -$1.20, your week 2 NFL best bet. And let's hope it goes a little bit better than the way things went for us in week 1 with the Pittsburgh Steelers game essentially falling outside the number after the opening drive. All right, my friend, I think you acquitted yourself quite nicely in your Bet the Board debut in the spoken capacity compared to the written word. Anything else you'd like to share? I mean, I know you are a prop maven. Like I alluded to, you've got a menagerie of bets already in action. I mean, if there's certain things that you're targeting that you feel like sharing with our listeners, you know they don't shy away from a little bit of extra
No,
action.
I would say if you're late to listening to this podcast and the Cincinnati line moves to 3.5 across the board, or even 4, let's say you're listening on a Saturday, which I do think this line's going to move, I would say looking at one of their team totals at 24, going over that price, or even total touchdowns over 2.5 at -160 or better makes sense. Tonight, I think there's going to be a good chance for Minnesota to have some success on the offensive side of the ball. There have been some 20.5s out there for their team total. I would potentially look at Kirk Cousins to go over longest completion as well. That's about it, bud.
All right, plenty of ways for our guys and girls to get involved as early as the Thursday night football game, the first one of the season. on Prime on Amazon. So encourage folks to check that out. And again, follow Billy. You should already be familiar with his work if you're a lifelong reader of the Bet the Board website. And we'll hope to get Billy integrated a little bit more on the podcast scene as the season progresses. So for Billy, for the absent Payne Insider, attending to a family matter, thankfully not all that serious. Easy for me to say. He'll be back with us early next week. I'm Todd Furman. Best of luck with all of your investments for NFL Week 2 and with a Cincinnati Bengals ticket. -3, minus $1.20 in hand. We'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Furman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.